In 1990, in a quiet town along Florida's I-75, a chilling discovery shattered the peace of the small community. 7 men were found, their bodies scattered across the highways, each one leaving behind an untold story. A grim trail of death stretched across central Florida, leaving the nation in shock. With each brutal murder, a sinister truth began to emerge.
In the very early stages, we didn't know who this victim was. But eventually, this victim was identified as a white male, 51 years of age, by the name of Richard Mallory.
After Mr. Mallory's case goes cold, bodies start being found throughout Central Florida.
As investigators followed the trail, a shocking realization began to form. For the first time in criminal history, these killings seemed to be carried out with a feminine touch. Months later, the unthinkable happened. A woman was arrested. Her name, Aileen Wuornos. With evidence mounting against her, she was sentenced to death for the murder. And before the sentencing for the Richard Mallory murder, Aileen said to Judge Muriel Blunt,
"What I did was what anybody else would do. I defended myself, which everybody has the right to defend themselves. And I had no intentions of killing anyone. I would not do that. I'm not that type of person."
Aileen Wuornos underwent several trials, each one marked by her persistent claims of innocence.
He was choking me and I was holding it like this. And he said, "Do you want to die, slut?" And I just nodded no.
Despite being found guilty of 7 murders, she repeatedly altered her story.
The majority of the jury, by a vote of 12-0, advise and recommend to the court that it impose the death penalty upon Aileen.
Attempting to justify her actions.
Aileen, how do you feel about the verdict? Innocent. And I was raped. And I was tortured. And they had a steering wheel. And it had scratches all over it. It's broken. It's proof that I was tied to the steering wheel, and I cannot believe that what happened. Why did the jury find you guilty? I think it's immediate cover.
But with each trial, her anger grew. The judges, unwavering in their verdicts, sentenced her to death for each victim.
Case number 91-112, Citrus County case number.
They dismissed her claims of self-defense, failing to acknowledge the justification she believed was behind her actions, that she had been raped.
Okay, there will be an automatic appeal. You have the right to an appeal. Mr. Glazer, is that going to be handled by you or the
Your
public
wife and
defender?
kids get raped.
I would ask that you would
Right
appoint
in
the
the
public defender's
ass.
office.
Aileen seemed to believe a miracle might still happen. But when the verdict was read, she realized there was no escape. 3 more death sentences were handed down to her, sealing her fate. And that's when her fury erupted.
Now
Putting
concluded.
somebody who was raped to death.
For a decade, Aileen fought relentlessly against her fate. Appeal after appeal, she insisted on her innocence.
I say it's this. The principle is self-defense. They say it's the number. I say it's the principle. The heck with what... It has nothing to do with the number killed. It's the principle. But they're saying if there's a number. No. Self-defense is self-defense no matter how many times it is. I don't care if it's 100 times. I never provoked those guys. I never provoked them. I never showed any provocations whatsoever. It was very nice, very decent, very clean, very ladylike. I didn't even swear in front of my clients. And a lot of my clients, I talked about Jesus and I talked political. Both mixed together, and we never argued.
But over time, a dramatic shift took place within her. Her defiance turned to resolve.
Okay, I cannot go in the execution chamber and die in the execution chamber as a liar.
She no longer sought to delay the inevitable. Instead, she demanded her execution.
And I got to come clean that I killed those 7 men in first-degree murder and robbery. As they said, they had it right. A serial killer.
According to her, the torture she endured in prison became the catalyst, and she no longer wanted to maintain her innocence. She sought no further delay in her execution.
Yeah, I'm ready to go. Hey, I was tortured at BCI. They had They had the intercom on in the room, and they kept lying that it wasn't on, and they were using sonic pressure on my head since 1997.
Sonic
And every
pressure.
time I was trying to write something, I think they had some kind of eye in the cell, I'm not sure, but every time I started writing something, it went up higher. So I'm thinking that probably had the TV rigged.
Did that affect your mind in some way, the sonic?
It was crushing my head, and they were using sonic pressure continually. I suffered so bad. I was really struggling to survive. Had a lot of trays that were attempted murder and everything. I had to wash all my food off. And then one day I didn't wash my food off, and I was sick for 3 weeks, almost died.
So consider this. It was her last chance before her execution. She spoke of every suffering she had endured in prison. She revealed to the judge why she had accepted the murder, still maintaining her innocence despite the weight of her actions.
Are you saying that you killed in self-defense or in cold blood? What do you, because you changed your story. I'm just trying to
What are you
understand.
talking about? Change story on what?
No, about whether it was self-defense or not.
I'm not going to say, I'm not going to get in depth about my cases, Nick. I'm on my way to the chamber, nothing stopping it. You can believe it or you don't have to believe it. That's up to you, man. Put a big question mark on your film.
Not everybody is killing 7 people. So there must have been something in you that was getting you to do
Oh, you
that.
are lost, Nick! Yeah, thanks a lot. I lost my fucking life because of it. Couldn't even get a fair trial. Couldn't even get a fair investigation or nothing. Couldn't even have my appeals right. You sabotaged my ass, society, and the cops, and the system. A raped woman got executed. It was used for books and movies and shit. Ladder climbs, the re-election, everything else. I got a big finger in all your faces. Thanks a lot. You're an inhumane bunch of fucking living bastards and bitches, and you're gonna get your asses nuked in the end. And pretty soon it's coming. We're gonna have to cut this interview, Nick. I'm not going to go into any more detail. I'm leaving. I'm glad. Thanks a lot, society, for railroading my ass.
And before her execution, she mentioned, "We are all evils."
All of us are full of evil, one way or another.
Words eerily similar to those spoken by Richard Ramirez, one of America's most infamous serial killers.
We are all evil in some form or another, are we not?
I'm asking you the questions, my friend.
Did Aileen have the same troubled childhood that Richard Ramirez had, or was it even worse than the backgrounds of other notorious serial killers? To uncover the truth, we must go back to the beginning, her troubled childhood, her escalating crimes, and the psychological factors that turned her into the woman who would come to be known as the Damsel of Death. Aileen's life began on February 29, 1956, as Aileen Carol Pittman. From the very start, it was nothing short of tragic. Ironically, one of the few blessings in her early years was never meeting her biological father, Leo Dale Pittman, a convicted child molester with a psychopathic streak. Pittman's life spiraled even further into darkness when he hanged himself in prison in 1969. Before his death, his grandmother doted on him, showering him with affection, cakes, and money. But he repaid her kindness with cruelty. After his grandfather's death from throat cancer, Pittman's grandmother tried to fill the void with love and care. She spoiled him relentlessly, baking him cakes and offering him money, but her kindness was met with horrifying cruelty. As a teenager, Pittman turned on her, subjecting her to physical abuse. His twisted nature extended to shocking acts of animal cruelty. He would tie 2 cats together by their tails and throw them over a clothesline to watch them fight. Amid this chaos, Diane was just 14 when she fell in love with Leo, a man with a dark past. Her father and mother certainly didn't approve of their relationship, but before they could stop them, they were married. The newlyweds' first child, Keith, was born. Soon after, Leo was arrested for a series of petty crimes. To avoid prison, he was allowed to enlist in the army. He left home, and Diane saw an opportunity to flee. 7 months later, Diane gave birth to Aileen. She tried to struggle on her own with 2 young children, but the burden was too much. Ultimately, she ran home to her parents. Diane abandoned Aileen and Keith, and would never reclaim them. Aileen would never meet her biological father. 10 years later, Leo was convicted of raping a 7-year-old girl. In 1969, he hanged himself in his Kansas prison cell. Diane's parents, Lowry and Britta Wuornos, adopted Aileen and Keith, raising them alongside their own children, Barry and Lori, in nearby Troy, Michigan. However, the truth of this arrangement was hidden. Aileen and Keith were led to believe Lori and Britta were their parents. It wasn't until Aileen was around 12 years old that she uncovered the painful truth, adding yet another layer of heartbreak to her already troubled life. Lori Wuornos was a heavy drinker and ruled the household with a strict, often harsh hand. When Aileen and Keith uncovered the secret of their true parentage, they reacted with rebellion. Tragedy struck in 1962 when 6-year-old Aileen suffered severe burns while she and Keith recklessly played with lighter fluid, setting fires. The incident left her with permanent scars, both physical and emotional. Though Aileen physically recovered from the burns, her face bore permanent scars, cruel reminders of her tumultuous childhood. Life under Lori's roof was anything but kind. Punishments were severe and relentless. The sting of a doubled-over belt would strike her bare skin, leaving her sobbing in terror. At times, the young Aileen was forced to lie face down, utterly exposed, awaiting the next lashing, a haunting glimpse into the harsh realities she endured. Aileen's life spiraled into chaos from a young age. She became sexually active at a shockingly young age and later claimed to police that she had been involved with her own brother, Keith, though others cast doubt on this disturbing claim. By age 14, Aileen was pregnant and sent to an unwed mother's home. In 1971, she gave birth to a baby boy who was quickly placed for adoption, sparing the child from the tumult of Aileen's troubled world. Thankfully, Aileen's baby was spared the chaos of her life as he was placed for adoption. However, tragedy struck again in July of the same year when Britta Wuornos, Aileen's grandmother, passed away, allegedly due to liver failure. Diane, Aileen's biological mother, suspected foul play, believing Lori had a hand in her death. Aileen and Keith's rebellious behavior, along with Aileen's pregnancy, had placed immense strain on Britta, driving her to drink heavily once more. On the night of her death, Britta suffered violent convulsions, and Lori's failure to call for medical help, supposedly due to a lack of money, only deepened the shadows of suspicion. Aileen, often called Lee by those who knew her, abandoned school and home, plunging into a life of hitchhiking and prostitution. The following years brought more heartbreak. Her beloved brother Keith succumbed to throat cancer at just 21 years old, and Lori, her grandfather, took his own life. Seeking escape from her tragic past, Aileen made her way to Florida. At the age of 20, while hitchhiking, she crossed paths with a wealthy 69-year-old yacht club president named Louis Fell, an encounter that would briefly alter the course of her life. Louis Fell was captivated by Aileen almost immediately. Their whirlwind romance led to marriage in 1976, a union so noteworthy that it even made the society pages. For Aileen, this could have been a chance at a stable, prosperous life, but her turbulent nature wouldn't allow it. She mistreated Fell, indulged in bar fights, and even landed in jail for assault. Within weeks, Fell came to regret his decision. Unable to withstand her destructive behavior, he had the marriage annulled just a month later. The next decade of Aileen's life was a chaotic downward spiral. She drifted through one failed relationship after another, surviving through prostitution, forgery, theft, and armed robbery. Despair consumed her, leading to a failed suicide attempt. Years of drinking, drug use, and a self-destructive lifestyle left her emotionally shattered and physically worn down, a shadow of the person she might have been. In 1986, Aileen's life took a turn when she met 24-year-old Tyria Moore at a gay bar in Daytona. At the time, Aileen was consumed by loneliness and anger, desperately searching for connection. Tyria, or Ty, offered her something Aileen had rarely experienced: love and stability. For a while, their relationship flourished. Ty quit her job as a motel maid and depended on Aileen's prostitution earnings, which Aileen willingly provided, hoping to keep Ty close. Over time, the passion between Aileen and Ty began to fade, and financial struggles set in. Despite their hardships, Ty remained by Aileen's side, moving with her from one rundown motel to another, occasionally resorting to sleeping in abandoned barns or the woods. Aileen's dwindling appeal as a prostitute only deepened their financial despair. Their meager existence grew increasingly unsustainable, and it became clear something had to give. Richard Mallory was no stranger to sudden changes. The middle-aged owner of an electronics repair shop in Clearwater, Florida, often vanished without warning, indulging in drinking and sex binges that could last for days. Paranoia ruled his life. He changed the locks on his apartment 8 times in just 3 years. His erratic behavior extended to his business, where he hired employees only long enough to catch up on repair orders before letting them go, retreating into his unpredictable cycles once again. Alcohol, sex, and paranoia were the only constants in Richard Mallory's life. So, when he failed to open his shop in early December 1989, it didn't raise much alarm. Mallory lived such an isolated life that no one was close enough to notice or care that he had disappeared. It wasn't until his 1,977 Cadillac turned up abandoned near Daytona that anyone suspected something was wrong. Days later, on December 13, 1989, 2 young men scavenging for scrap metal along a dirt road near Interstate 95 in Volusia County, Florida, stumbled upon a horrifying discovery: Mallory's lifeless body wrapped in a rubber-backed carpet runner. Despite the body's advanced state of decomposition, investigators managed to extract fingerprints, confirming the victim as Richard Mallory, who had vanished 13 days earlier. He had been shot 3 times with a .22 caliber weapon. Months of investigation into Mallory's dark and shady lifestyle yielded no solid leads. Early suspicion fell on a local stripper known as Chastity, but the case would soon take a much darker turn. Sue Russell recounts that Chastity, in a fit of rage at her boyfriend, claimed she had partied with Mallory for days and even killed him. Investigators arrested her, but it didn't take long to uncover the truth. Her confession was nothing more than a heated outburst. With no credible leads to follow, the investigation into Mallory's murder eventually went cold. On June 1, a grim discovery was made in the woods of Citrus County, Florida, roughly 40 miles north of Tampa. The body of a naked male, initially unidentified, was found abandoned among the trees. Days later, on June 7, 1990, the victim was identified as David Spears, a 43-year-old heavy equipment operator from Sarasota who had last been seen on May 19th. David Spears had told his boss he was heading to Orlando, but he never arrived. Shortly after his disappearance, his truck was discovered abandoned on Interstate 75, its doors unlocked and the license plate missing. Spears had been brutally shot multiple times with a .22 caliber weapon. Adding a disturbing layer to the scene, a used condom was found near his lifeless body. Just days later, on June 6, another grim discovery was made 30 miles south in Pasco County. A naked body was found a few miles from Interstate 75, so badly decomposed that medical examiners couldn't retrieve fingerprints or determine the exact time of death. Despite the state of the remains, 9 bullets recovered from the body were identified as being fired from a .22 caliber weapon, deepening the mystery. Pasco County Detective Tom Muck struggled to identify the remains of the unknown victim, who was later identified as Charles Carskaddon. However, Muck had already noted eerie similarities between this case and the murder in Citrus County. Acting on his instincts, he contacted Citrus County Sheriff's investigator Marvin Paget and urged him to stay connected as the investigations unfolded. On July 4, chaos erupted near State Road 315 in Orange Springs, Florida, when a car veered off the road and crashed into some brush. Rhonda Bailey, watching from her porch, witnessed the commotion. she saw two women scramble out of the wreckage, frantically throwing beer cans into the woods while arguing and swearing at each other. The brown-haired woman remained mostly silent, while the blonde, bleeding from an injured arm, did most of the talking. The blonde woman pleaded with Bailey not to call the police, claiming her father lived just up the road. She and her companion managed to get their battered car, windshield shattered and body damaged, out of the brush. However, the car didn't make it far before breaking down completely. Abandoning the crippled vehicle, the pair continued their journey on foot. Hubert Hewitt, a member of the Orange Springs Volunteer Fire Department, arrived at the scene after receiving a call about the accident. When he approached the two women and asked if they had been involved, the blonde snapped at him, cursing and denying their involvement. She made it clear they didn't want any help, so Hewitt left them alone as they continued walking down the road. Marion County Sheriff's deputies soon located the abandoned car left behind by the two women. It was a gray, four-door 1988 Pontiac Sunbird. The vehicle was in shambles. The windshield and front door windows were shattered, bloodstains were visible throughout the interior, and the license plate was missing. A VIN number search revealed the car belonged to Peter Seams, a retired seaman from Jupiter, Florida, who had mysteriously disappeared on June 7th while traveling to visit family in Arkansas. Peter Seams, a 65-year-old retired merchant seaman, was known for dedicating much of his time to a Christian outreach ministry. When he was reported missing, John Wisniewski of the Jupiter Police took charge of the investigation. He distributed a nationwide teletype with descriptions of the two women spotted near Seams's car and provided a detailed synopsis and sketches to the Florida Criminal Activity Bulletin. Despite his efforts, Wisniewski held little hope of finding Seams alive. On the morning of July 30th, Troy Burris began his delivery route for Gilchrist sausage as usual. However, when he failed to return that afternoon, concern quickly grew. Gilchrist manager Johnny May Thompson began making calls and discovered that Burris hadn't completed his last few delivery stops. Late that evening, Thompson and her husband went searching for him, but their efforts came up empty. At 2 a.m., Burris' wife officially reported him missing. By 4 a.m., Marion County Sheriff's deputies discovered Burris's truck abandoned along the shoulder of State Road 19, about 20 miles east of Ocala. The truck was unlocked, the keys were missing, and there was no sign of Burris. 5 days later, a family on a picnic in the Ocala National Forest made a horrifying discovery: Burris's lifeless body in a clearing just 8 miles from where his truck had been found. The intense Florida heat and humidity had accelerated decomposition, but his wife confirmed his identity by recognizing his wedding ring. Troy Burris had been killed by 2 shots from a .22 caliber gun, one to the chest and another to the back. Investigator John Tilley initially focused on a drifter named Curtis Michael Blankenship, who had been hitchhiking along Highway 19 the day Burris disappeared and was found near the abandoned truck. However, as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Blankenship was not connected to the murder. With no further leads, Tilley was left at a standstill. Dick Humphreys vanished on September 11, 1990, the day after celebrating his 35th wedding anniversary. At 56, he was wrapping up his final day at the Sumterville office of Florida's Department of Health and Rehabilitation Services, where he worked as a protective investigator specializing in cases of abused and injured children. Humphreys had already lived a distinguished life, having previously served as a police chief in Alabama. But on what should have been a routine day, he never made it home. On the evening of September 12, 1990, Dick Humphreys' lifeless body was discovered in Marion County. He had been shot 7 times, with 6.22 caliber bullets recovered from his body. The 7th bullet, which tore through his wrist, was never found. Later that month, his abandoned car was located in Suwannee County, further deepening the mystery surrounding his murder. Roughly a month later, on November 19, 1990, the nude body of Walter Gino Antonio was discovered on a logging road in Dixie County. Antonio, a 60-year-old trucker, part-time security guard, and reserve police member, had been shot 4 times with a .22 caliber weapon. Investigators determined he had been dead for less than 24 hours. 5 days later, his car was found abandoned across the state in Brevard County. Captain Steve Binniger of the Marion County Sheriff's Criminal Investigation Division was well aware of the murders in Citrus and Pasco counties. As the cases piled up, he couldn't ignore the striking similarities between them. Working with a multi-agency task force, Binniger began piecing together a theory. By 1990, hitchhiking had become rare, with most people wary of strangers. This led Binniger to a bold conclusion. The perpetrator or perpetrators must have appeared non-threatening, perhaps even women. Binniger's suspicions centered on 2 women, those seen abandoning Peter Siems's car after the crash. To expand the search, he enlisted the help of the media. In late November, Reuters published a story about the murders, revealing that police were searching for 2 women. Newspapers across Florida quickly picked up the story, featuring police sketches of the suspects. The coverage worked. By mid-December, tips began flooding in, all pointing to the same pair of women. One tip came from a man in Homosassa Springs, who claimed the women had rented a trailer from him about a year earlier. He identified them as Tyria Moore and Lee. Another lead came from a woman in Tampa who said the pair had worked at her motel south of Ocala under the names Tyria Moore and Susan Blahovec. An anonymous caller added that the women had purchased an RV in the area, describing Lee Blahovec as the dominant one in the relationship and a known truck stop prostitute. Both women were reported to be lesbians. The breakthrough came from Port Orange, near Daytona, where police had been monitoring the movements of Lee Blahovec and Tyria Moore. They provided a detailed timeline of the couple's activities between late September and mid-December. The women primarily stayed at the Fairview motels in Harbor Oaks, where Blahovec used the alias Cammie Marsh Green. They also briefly lived in a small apartment behind a nearby restaurant before returning to the motel. In early December, the 2 left the Fairview, but Blahovec, under the Green alias, returned alone and stayed until December 10. A computer search revealed the driver's license and criminal record information for Tyria Moore, Susan Blahovec, and Cammie Marsh Green. Moore's record was clean, apart from a breaking and entering charge from 1983 that had been dropped. Blahovec had a single trespassing arrest, while Green had no criminal record at all. However, investigators noticed a crucial detail. The photograph on Blahovec's license didn't match the one for Green. It was the Green alias that ultimately provided the key lead investigators needed. Volusia County officers began investigating local pawn shops, uncovering a critical piece of evidence. In Daytona, Cammie Marsh Green had pawned a camera and a radar detector, leaving her thumbprint on the receipt. Both items were traced back to Richard Mallory. In Ormond Beach, Green had also pawned tools matching the description of those stolen from David Spears' truck. The thumbprint left behind would prove to be the key to unraveling the case. Jenny Ahern, an expert with the automated fingerprint identification system, initially came up empty in her computer search for a match. Determined, she traveled to Volusia County and began manually searching fingerprint records. Within an hour, she found the breakthrough: a match linked to a prior weapons charge and an outstanding warrant for a woman named Lori Grote. To solidify the case, a bloody palm print found in Peter Siems's Sunbird was also matched to Lori Grote. This critical information was immediately sent to the National Crime Information Center. Information poured in from Michigan, Colorado, and Florida, confirming that Lori Grote, Susan Blahovec, and Cammie Marsh Green were all aliases for one person, Aileen Wuornos. With her true identity revealed, the hunt for Wuornos intensified. On January 5, 1991, law enforcement launched a full-scale search. Pairs of officers, including 2 undercover agents posing as drug dealers nicknamed Bucket and Drums, hit the streets, determined to track her down. On the evening of January 8, 1991, undercover agents Mike Joyner and Dick Martin, working as Bucket and Drums, spotted Wuornos at the Port Orange pub. Their plan was to proceed cautiously, building an airtight case before making an arrest. However, their strategy was abruptly disrupted when Port Orange police unexpectedly intervened and escorted Wuornos outside. Alarmed, Joyner quickly called the command post at the Pirates Cove Motel, where law enforcement from 6 jurisdictions had gathered to coordinate the case. The sudden action wasn't due to a leak. It was simply a case of officers doing their jobs without realizing the larger operation at play. Bob Kelly of the Volusia County Sheriff's Office quickly contacted the Port Orange Police Station, instructing them not to arrest Wuornos under any circumstances. His message arrived just in time, and Wuornos was allowed to return to the bar, unaware of how closely she was being watched. Back inside, Joyner and Martin resumed their undercover roles, striking up a conversation with her and buying her a few beers. Around 10 p.m., Wuornos left the bar, declining their offer for a ride. Yet again, the operation nearly unraveled. As Wuornos walked down Ridgewood Avenue, 2 Florida Department of Law Enforcement officers unknowingly trailed her with their lights off, jeopardizing the undercover efforts. A swift call from the command post redirected the officers, allowing Wuornos to reach her next stop, a biker bar fittingly named The Last Resort. Joyner and Martin followed her there, continuing their ruse by chatting with her and sharing more beers. They left shortly after midnight, but Wuornos stayed behind. That night, she slept on an old car seat inside the bar, completely unaware that it would be her last night of freedom. The next afternoon, Joyner and Martin returned to The Last Resort in their undercover roles as Bucket and Drums. They continued chatting with Wuornos while wearing hidden transmitters, keeping the command post informed of every move. Initially, they planned to delay the arrest until later that evening, but the bar was preparing for a large barbecue event, and bikers were expected to flood in at any moment. Realizing the growing risk of losing control of the situation, the command post made the call. It was time to move forward with the arrest. Joyner and Martin casually invited Wuornos to their motel room, suggesting she might like to freshen up. She agreed and left the bar with them. However, as they stepped outside, Larry Horspa of the Volusia County Sheriff's Office approached her. Calmly, he informed Wuornos that she was being arrested on an outstanding warrant for Lori Grody. No mention was made of the murders, and no statements were given to the media about her arrest. This cautious approach was intentional. Without the murder weapon or Tyria Moore in custody, investigators needed to proceed carefully. On January 10th, investigators finally located Tyria Moore. She was staying with her sister in Pittston, Pennsylvania. Detectives Jerry Thompson from Citrus County and Bruce Munster from Marion County traveled to Scranton to question her. Moore was read her rights but was not charged with any crimes. Munster emphasized the seriousness of perjury, swore her in, and then allowed her to recount her story, which would soon play a pivotal role in the case. Moore admitted to detectives that she had known about the murder since the day Lee returned home driving Richard Mallory's Cadillac. According to Moore, Lee openly confessed to killing a man that day. "I told her I didn't want to hear about it," Moore explained to Munster and Thompson. Each time Lee came home and mentioned something suspicious, such as how she obtained certain items, Moore would cut her off, insisting, "I don't want to hear it." While she had her suspicions, Moore deliberately avoided learning too much, fearing what that knowledge might mean. Moore explained that the less she knew, the less responsibility she felt to report Lee to the authorities, a line she wasn't ready to cross. "I was just scared," she admitted. Although Lee had reassured her time and time again that she would never harm her, Moore confessed, "You can't believe her. I didn't know what she would have done." Her fear of Lee's unpredictable behavior kept her silent. The following day, Moore agreed to return to Florida with detectives Munster and Thompson to assist in the investigation. They shared their strategy with her during the flight. A confession from Lee would solidify their case. To achieve this, they planned to place Moore in a Daytona motel and have her contact Lee in jail. Moore would tell Lee that she had received money from her mother and had traveled to Florida to collect the rest of her belongings. The hope was that Lee's loyalty to Moore would lead to a confession. The phone calls between Moore and Wuornos would be carefully recorded as part of the plan. Moore was instructed to tell Wuornos that the authorities had been questioning her family and that she feared being falsely implicated in the Florida murders. Munster and Thompson believed Wuornos' loyalty to Moore would compel her to confess. On January 14th, the first call came in. At the time, Wuornos still believed she was only being held for the Lori Grody weapons violation. When Moore expressed her fears and suspicions, Wuornos tried to reassure her. "I'm only in here for that concealed weapons charge from '86 and a traffic ticket," she insisted. Wuornos even mentioned reading the newspapers, confidently adding, "I wasn't one of those little suspects." However, she was acutely aware that the jailhouse phone was being monitored. To protect herself, she spoke in vague, coded language and attempted to construct alibis. During their conversations, Wuornos continued to insist, I think someone at work, where you worked, said something that it looked like us, but it's not us. It's a case of mistaken identity. Over the next 3 days, the calls continued. Moore became increasingly urgent, claiming that the police were closing in on her. It became evident that Wuornos understood what was expected of her. She even voiced concerns that Moore wasn't alone, that someone else might be listening in and recording their conversations. As time went on, Wuornos grew less cautious about what she said. Her sense of loyalty to Moore became clearer. She refused to let her partner take the fall. Just tell them what they need to know, what they want to know, or anything, Wuornos said. I'll cover for you because you're innocent. I'm not going to let you go to jail. Listen, if I have to confess, I will, Wuornos told Moore. And on the morning of January 16th, she did just that. During her confession to detectives Larry Horzippa and Bruce Munster, Wuornos repeated 2 key points. First, she adamantly insisted that Moore had no involvement in the murders. Second, she emphasized that nothing was her fault, not the killings, nor the series of tragic events that had led her down the path of crime. Wuornos insisted that all the killings were acts of self-defense. She claimed each victim had either assaulted, threatened, or raped her. As she spoke, her story seemed to evolve. When she felt she had said something too incriminating, she would quickly revise it, altering details to fit her narrative. She stated that she had been raped several times in the past few years and had reached her breaking point. According to Wuornos, when her victims became aggressive, she killed out of fear. On several occasions, Michael O'Neill, a public defender from the Volusia County Public Defender's Office, urged Wuornos to stop talking. Frustrated, he asked, "Do you realize these guys are cops?" Wuornos calmly replied, "I know, and they want to hang me. That's fine, because maybe I deserve it. I just want to get this over with." Following her confession, an influx of book and movie offers flooded in, directed at detectives, relatives, Moore, and even Wuornos herself. Wuornos seemed to believe that her story would make her millions, unaware that Florida had laws preventing criminals from profiting off their crimes. As her case gained national attention, she became a media sensation, relishing her newfound fame. She eagerly spoke to anyone who would listen, including Volusia County jail staff, continually refining her version of events, each time portraying herself in a more sympathetic light. In the midst of the media frenzy, Aileen Wuornos, a 44-year-old born-again Christian who ran a horse breeding and boarding business near Ocala, came into the picture. After seeing Wuornos' photo in the newspaper, Wuornos felt compelled to reach out. "My name is Aileen Wuornos," she wrote. "I'm born again. You're probably going to think I'm crazy, but Jesus told me to write to you." She included her home telephone number, and on January 30th, Wuornos called her collect for the first time. Wuornos quickly became a devoted defender and supporter of Wuornos. She reassured Wuornos that her public defenders, like everyone else, were trying to profit from her story. Wuornos, trusting Wuornos' advice, requested and was granted new attorneys. Wuornos became vocal in the media, describing her bond with Wuornos to a Vanity Fair reporter as soul-binding. "We're like Jonathan and David in the Bible," she explained. "It's as if part of me is trapped in jail with her. We always know what the other is feeling and thinking." To another reporter, Wuornos stated, "If the world could know the real Aileen Wuornos, there's not a jury that would convict her." In 1991, Wuornos made numerous appearances on talk shows and in tabloids, tirelessly speaking to anyone who would listen about what she believed to be Wuornos' true, virtuous nature. She arranged interviews for Wuornos with reporters she deemed sympathetic, providing Wuornos a platform to continue sharing and embellishing her increasingly elaborate story. Together, Wuornos and Wuornos highlighted her tragic upbringing, while both women accused anyone they could of corruption and complicity. Whether it was the agents offering book and movie deals, the detectives, the attorneys, or especially Tyria Moore. Just when things seemed as strange as they could get, they took an even more bizarre turn. On November 22, 1991, Aileen Wuornos and her husband legally adopted Aileen Wuornos, claiming it was a decision guided by God. Meanwhile, Wuornos' attorneys negotiated a plea bargain, which Wuornos agreed to. As part of the deal, she would plead guilty to 6 charges and receive 6 consecutive life sentences. Despite the plea bargain, one state attorney argued that Wuornos should face the death penalty. As a result, on January 14, 1992, Wuornos stood trial for the murder of Richard Mallory. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Dr. Arthur Botting, the medical examiner who had performed the autopsy on Mallory's body, testified that Mallory endured between 10 and 20 excruciating minutes before he died. Tyria Moore took the stand, stating that Wuornos had not seemed particularly upset, nervous, or intoxicated when she confessed to killing Mallory. Additionally, 12 men came forward with testimonies about their encounters with Wuornos along Florida's highways. Under Florida's Williams Rule, evidence of other crimes could be used to establish a pattern, and the prosecution introduced this evidence to further solidify their case. Thanks to the Williams Rule, the jury was presented with evidence of the other murders, painting a much broader picture of Wuornos's criminal history. Had the jury only known about Mallory, Wuornos's claim of killing in self-defense might have seemed plausible. However, with the knowledge of all the killings, the self-defense narrative seemed highly unlikely. After excerpts from her videotaped confession were shown, the self-defense claim lost all credibility. In the video, Wuornos appeared calm and untroubled as she casually recounted the murders, often interrupting her public defender, telling him to be quiet. On the video, Wuornos's demeanor spoke volumes. "I took a life. I am willing to give up my life because I killed people who deserve to die," she stated without hesitation. Tricia Jenkins, one of Wuornos's public defenders, advised against her testifying, but Wuornos was determined to tell her story. By the time she took the stand, her version of Mallory's murder had evolved significantly from her earlier confession. She now claimed that Mallory had raped, sodomized, and tortured her. During cross-examination, prosecutor John Tanner dismantled her credibility, exposing the lies and inconsistencies in her testimony. As the truth came to light, Wuornos grew increasingly agitated and angry. Wuornos' attorneys continued advising her to refrain from answering questions, but she invoked her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination 25 times. She was the only witness for her defense, and by the time she left the stand, it was clear how her trial would likely conclude. On January 27th, Judge Uriel Blount charged the jury, who deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a verdict. Wuornos was found guilty of first-degree murder. As the jury filed out, she erupted in rage, shouting in the courtroom. Her outburst lingered in the minds of the jurors as they prepared for the penalty phase of her trial the following day. Defense experts testified that Wuornos was mentally ill, suffering from borderline personality disorder, and that her traumatic upbringing had irreparably damaged her. Jenkins, her public defender, described her as a damaged, primitive child, pleading for the jury to show mercy and spare Wuornos's life. However, the jurors could not forget the woman they had seen during the trial, nor could they forgive the horrific acts she had committed. With a unanimous verdict, they recommended the death penalty, urging Judge Blount to sentence her to the electric chair. Judge Blount carried out the jury's recommendation on January 31st, sentencing Wuornos to death. She would not stand trial again. On March 31, 1992, Wuornos entered a plea of no contest to the murders of Dick Humphreys, Troy Burris, and David Spears, stating that she wanted to get right with God. In a lengthy and disjointed statement to the court, Wuornos declared her intention to face her fate. She ended her monologue by turning to Assistant State Attorney Rick Ridgway and hissing. On May 15th, Judge Thomas Sawaya handed her 3 additional death sentences. Wuornos responded with an obscene gesture, muttering in defiance. In June 1992, she pleaded guilty to the murder of Charles Carskadon, earning her a 4th death sentence. In November of the same year, she received her 5th death sentence after pleading guilty to the murder of Walter Gino Antonio. No charges were ever filed for the murder of Peter Seams, as his body was never recovered. For a brief period, there was speculation that Wuornos might be granted a new trial for the murder of Richard Mallory. New evidence surfaced revealing that Mallory had spent 10 years in prison for sexual violence, prompting attorneys to believe that the jury might have reached a different verdict had they known this crucial detail. No new trial was granted, however. The Florida Supreme Court upheld all 6 of Wuornos's death sentences. According to the Associated Press, she was given the option to choose lethal injection over the electric chair, altering the method of her execution. In October 2002, CNN reported that Governor Jeb Bush had issued a temporary stay of execution and ordered a mental evaluation. The stay was lifted within the first week of October after 3 psychiatrists concluded that Wuornos fully understood the reason for her execution and the inevitability of her death. On October 9, 2002, More than a decade after murdering 6 men along Central Florida highways while working as a prostitute, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at 9:47 a.m. at Florida State Prison near Stark, Florida. At 46, Wuornos became the 10th woman to be executed in the U.S. and the second woman in Florida since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, 51 men had been executed in Florida between 1976 and October 2002. Judy Buenano was the only other woman executed in Florida during this period. From the execution chamber, Wuornos made a final statement referencing the rock as a biblical allusion to Jesus. For years, she maintained that she shot the men in self-defense, claiming she had been raped and sodomized. Eventually, she recanted these claims, stating that she wanted to make peace with God. Wuornos also insisted she had killed a 7th man, though this was never confirmed. Her troubled life story inspired 2 movies, several books, and an opera titled Wuornos by Carla Lucero. Just days before her execution, Wuornos gave her last media interview to British producer Nick Broomfield, who had documented her life in 1993. However, she abruptly stormed out after only 35 minutes, according to Broomfield. Nick Broomfield's conclusion after his final interview with Wuornos was blunt. "Today, we are executing someone who is mad. She has completely lost her mind." However, State Attorney John Tanner, who had observed Wuornos during a psychiatric evaluation, disagreed. He stated that she was fully aware and lucid, and knew exactly what she was doing. In October 2002, serial killer Aileen Lee Wuornos, who confessed to fatally shooting 7 men along Florida's highways, was executed by lethal injection. In a tragic twist, despite having 6 death sentences, it was Wuornos' own choice to end her life that day. Her execution was carried out amid a hotbed of controversy about capital punishment in the U.S., with Illinois Governor Ryan at the forefront. Ryan declared a total moratorium on executions in his state after it released its 13th wrongly convicted prisoner. Florida Governor Jeb Bush also stayed some executions. Lee put herself on a different track, however, by becoming that rarity, a volunteer for execution. Had Wuornos not chosen to end her life, she would likely still be alive today, confined to a stark 6 by 9 foot prison cell, seeing only guards, and deprived of human connection. She had simply reached the point where she had enough. Her desire to die was not new. Wuornos had first expressed her wish for the execution to proceed a decade earlier, after her first guilty verdict. "I want to get right with God," she had said. Despite some moments of doubt and her lawyer's attempts to convince her otherwise, Wuornos remained resolute in her decision over the years. Wuornos fought for and successfully won the right to dismiss her counsel. Several psychiatrists confirmed that she fully understood the consequences of waiving her right to further appeals, clearing the way for her death warrant. For Governor Jeb Bush, Wuornos' voluntary decision to end her life made it an easy choice. While he held off on signing other death warrants, he signed Wuornos's with finality. This, despite her various appellate lawyers' best efforts to talk her out of it. These crimes were indisputable thanks to her confession, though many believe there may be more victims whose stories have yet to surface. The real confusion lay in her motive. Like a predator, she methodically shot and robbed strangers, luring them in by hitchhiking and then offering sex once they were in their cars. Following her arrest, she was quickly branded a man-hating lesbian, a label that oversimplified the complexities of her motives. Much of the assumption about Wuornos' sexuality stemmed from her 4-year relationship with Tyria Moore, whom she referred to as her wife. Strikingly, Tyria's appearance, with her strawberry red hair, freckled face, and stocky build, resembled that of Leo Pittman, the father Wuornos never met. However, Wuornos is better described as bisexual. She had romantic and emotional relationships with both women and men, sometimes instigating sex even without financial exchange, choosing to be with some out of genuine affection. In 1981, Wuornos became deeply infatuated with a boyfriend, and when she believed their relationship was ending, she became so distraught that she contemplated suicide, unable to imagine life without him. That day, intoxicated, she bought a gun, but rather than taking her own life, she chose to rob a supermarket while wearing a bikini. After serving 18 months of a 3-year sentence, she went on to live with another man, one of her many prison pen pals. Wuornos often claimed she enjoyed sex with men, but her relationship with Tyria deteriorated. Tyria eventually confided in her best friend about the decline in their sex life. Lee herself said that her greater love for Tyria wasn't sexual. The real driving force in Lee's life wasn't sex at all. It was a search for an emotional bond and love. Love that she'd never really had from her abandoning mother, her emotionally and physically abusive grandfather, or, it seems, from the grandmother who failed to protect her from him. Certainly not from the callous young males who had sex with her while she was an adolescent. She was far more familiar with loss than with love, having lost her beloved brother Keith to cancer at age 21 and having her baby son taken away from her after she gave birth at age 15. Wuornos finally found the deep emotional connection she had longed for in Tyria. Her borderline personality disorder intensified her overwhelming fear of abandonment. Looking back on the violent year in which she ended 7 lives, it became clear that at least 6 of the murders occurred during moments when she felt an intense fear of losing Tyria. This desperate fear likely triggered her actions, robbery and murder, what some profilers refer to as the precipitating factor. In Wuornos's mind, the only way to keep Tyria was by ensuring their survival with money. Almost every time, Wuornos killed men who had several $100s on them. As her appearance faded and her prostitution clients became harder to find, a few $100s meant a great deal to her. After each murder, she would return home with a smile, waving the money she had stolen and assuring Tyria that she could now cover their rent, buy beer, fund a trip to SeaWorld, or pay for whatever indulgence they desired. Later, Wuornos claimed that Tyria had become greedy and mercenary, and the money seemed to be the only thing keeping Tyria by her side, at least in Wuornos's mind. This belief gave Wuornos a sense of control. During one particularly violent 3-week stretch, when Wuornos murdered 3 men, Tyria's sister was staying with them, adding to the chaos of that time. The 2 sisters shared a close bond, and Wuornos grew increasingly paranoid, terrified that when Tyria's sister returned to Ohio, Tyria would leave with her. It's unclear whether Wuornos found any sexual thrill in killing, as male serial killers often do, though there was a sexual element to her crimes. Several of her victims were found naked. It was the killing of at least 3 strangers in different locations, with a cooling-off period between murders, that earned Wuornos the distinction of being the first female serial killer. As the first woman to fit the FBI's profile of a serial killer, Wuornos shattered expectations. Female serial killers usually target husbands, lovers, or vulnerable people, often driven by financial motives. While Wuornos did enjoy the power of controlling a man's life, she was also a robber who killed for pragmatic reasons. Her primary goal was to eliminate any potential witnesses. She carried a bottle of Windex along with her gun in her kill bag, always prepared to wipe away fingerprints and erase any trace of her presence. It's true that Wuornos harbored a deep hatred for men, but less acknowledged is that she despised people in general. Most people. Her life was fueled by a seething, uncontrollable anger. This rage, coupled with her volatile mood swings, drove away the very people she longed to keep close. Cammie Green, an old friend of Tyria's whose identity Wuornos had stolen, described her simply, "She had a bad attitude. I'm sure a lot of men hurt her, but it was people in general." Wuornos died as she had lived, alone. Tyria's betrayal of Wuornos was not only emotional. By cooperating with the police to help trap Wuornos into confessing to the murders, she also refused to make eye contact with her during court appearances. Meanwhile, Wuornos's adopted mother, Arlen Prowl, the Christian woman who had befriended and adopted her after her arrest, was conspicuously absent in the final days. Despite enduring much turmoil, their bond ultimately soured and fell apart. Prowl was so distant by the time of Wuornos' execution that she didn't even know the date it was scheduled for. The one constant in Wuornos' life was her old school friend from Michigan, Dawn, with whom she had once slept in cars as a teenager. In Wuornos' final years, Dawn remained her devoted pen pal and occasional visitor, even spending some of Wuornos' last hours with her on death row. Aileen Wuornos began her life starved for love, and, except for the support of Dawn, she ended it the same way.